professional cameras there videotaping us. And now I'm thinking, well, maybe ABC thought I was too stupid to send a crew for. But then later I found out that's not what was happening. It was Dr. Mark Carlotto, Earl Torn, and Richard who were the guests. And they were talking about the math. Dr. Carlotto had created a 3D shape from shading rendition of the face where it rotated. And Richard had given his copy of the tape to somebody at NASA to make a copy of it. And when Richard went to look for the person, he couldn't find them. Nobody knew where the tape was. He went scouring through the building, found the tape on an erase shelf waiting to be erased. And that was strange. But that was just part of the strange things that were going on. Anyway, when I got home, I turned the TV on, and Dan Rather said, today NASA held a briefing about Mars. And I'm going, wait a minute, there was no camera crews there. What are we looking at? Well, it turned out that day NASA sent out a press release announcing a briefing about Mars at the National Press Club. They never do anything like that without first putting it on their calendar in advance. And they said at that press conference, well, we plan to go back to Mars with the Mars Observer, and we plan to have a manned mission to Mars by the end of the century.
So basically a little rundown of things to come?
Yeah, but you see a manned mission to Mars.
It was counter-programming, George. What they did is NASA headquarters, to take the audience and the media away from what I was doing at Goddard with Mark Carlotto and Errol Torren.
Yep.
They instantly programmed a 11th hour press conference at the National Press Club to suck all the national media downtown away from Goddard.
And at that time, most networks had really one crew available for a specific topic.
Yep.
I mean, if this were 9/11, they'd have everybody working on it. But in this case, somebody was assigned to science, another assigned to, education and things like that. So the crew that would have covered you ended up going straight into the NASA news conference.
Well, what's so interesting is this was the first time I had absolute proof that we had enemies in NASA that did not want this information to get out.
I was going to say, now I'm beginning to understand why you have these feelings.
Well, they're not
about
feelings.
NASA.
There's evidence.
Oh, this gets even better. I mean, Richard, the camera crew, the non-professional video camera crew that was there, the only camera crew, Richard asked them to come in to videotape it because he had asked Goddard, can you do this for me? They said, oh, yeah, we'll videotape it for you. That day, it was like, oh, we can't do it. But luckily, Richard backed himself up. He had a camera crew come in, and they were able to videotape it, or there would be no record of it. And then that's where things started getting interesting. When I realized what NASA had done, or Goddard had done, or whoever was manipulating this whole thing, I wrote a letter to the president. It was
NASA headquarters.
Yeah. I wrote a letter to the president and vice president of Cap Cities ABC and to Rune Arledge, head of ABC News at the time.
Pretty gutsy, Keith.
Huh?
Pretty gutsy on your part.
Do you see why it was such a gem that we met?
Yeah.
Hey, I went to tell him, hey, we got duped. Here's what happened. And Arledge actually wrote back to me, and I have a letter that says, we'll keep an eye on this for a future story. Of course, the future's come and nothing's happened yet. But when I was doing this, I had this orthographically correct photo from Dr. Mark Carlotto. It was a multiple gray photo of Cydonia. I put it in this copy machine. This thing spit this thing out as black and white instead of multiple gray. I looked at this lousy copy, and I said, I can't use this.
Right.
But then I noticed there were these little mounds that were jutting all this light out. All the pyramidal structures, because there are pyramidal structures on Mars, people, these little mounds were jutting all this light out. And I was like, what are these? Because you didn't really notice them in the multiple gray photo.
Now, when Keith says little, these things, George, are on the scale of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, they're huge, but
they're almost 1,000 feet on a side. The big stuff is miles on a side, but these little guys are very bright, and I noted them in monuments, and I had kind of flagged them as interesting, but that's all we knew at that point about them.
Okay.
Well, I looked at it, and I said, well, if I play connect the dots, you get this curve. It's a nice curve. And I said, this is looking really interesting. So then I started measuring the spacing between the dots, and they were spaced exponentially. The spacing between the first and second doubled between the second and third, the second and third doubled between the third and the fourth. The distance between the fourth and the fifth didn't quite double. And I'm saying, well, why doesn't this fit? Skip it, go to the sixth one, and suddenly, boom, the distance between the third and fourth perfectly doubled between the fourth and the sixth. You go from the sixth one along to the fourth one, the same axis, the same distance, you come to another one.
Now, what are the odds of that happening, Keith, in nature? What are the odds of nature doing that?
Let's see. Dr. Horace Crater calculated that like 1,000,000 to 1 or 12,000,000 to 1. It was something outrageous.
Much higher. Yeah, exactly.
But this isn't the only exponential spacing. In Richard Hoagland's book, Dan Drazen points out the fact that if you go from the center of the city square out to the edge of the fort, one of the walls at the edge of the fort, that distance doubles to get from the fort out to the face, the teardrop on the face. That distance then doubles to get from the teardrop out to the cliff, which is this object that's 1,200 feet high, perpendicular to the splash pattern of the crater. The flow of the splash didn't back up behind it or cover it up, which means it was made after the crater, and you don't get nature doing things like that.
And that's a good point. And Richard, why do we call it the fort?
Because when I saw it on the original photos that Vince DiPietro and Greg Molinar sent me back in, 89, I guess, it just looked like one of these medieval forts that you see on aerial photographs taken of Europe, and I just stuck it on there as a kind of identifier on the photo, and the name is stuck now.
Yeah, George,
yeah,
I'm going to go back a little bit. When Goddard manipulated, or whoever manipulated our camera crew back then, they obviously are picking Richard's brain. Okay, he may have won the Angstrom Medal for excellence in science.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't deserve that. He deserves a Nobel Prize, which he will get, and I'll tell you why he's going to get it, because what they discovered is like Copernicus and Galileo going at it about what the solar system was about, okay? And this is a major discovery because once you understand it, you understand where we can get energy from. You understand how planets work. You understand that you could go to any solar system out here, find the exact same thing going on planets. And it's so scientifically beautiful. It's just astounding.
Well, with what your experience was in your background, Keith, and as you started telling people about some of the things that you were finding that Richard had already found, but you were looking at it with your own perspective. I mean, what were people telling you? You know, you're nuts, Keith, or were they really interested in this?
Well, a lot of people were kind of at first like ignoring me until some of the things that I told them in '85, like the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989, and communism falling all across Eastern Europe, and things like that, and they would tell me, oh, it'll never happen.
Richard, I guess you could say, too, that with Keith's credibility, and he's got a lot, that it adds additional credibility and credence to these things that you've been saying all along, all these years.
Well, it's always nice to have witnesses who are independent, who are objective, and also happen to work in a major global television network.
That helps.
And after the Goddard invitation, which was really a bolt out of the blue, I never expected that NASA officially would invite me and my colleagues to come and present to NASA scientists and engineers, and I never expected that I'd have a witness to the strangeness that went on around that in the 11th hour by headquarters to try to keep anybody from knowing this. And that was my first clue that we were in for a very long war, that the lines were drawn, that this was basically take no prisoners, and there was a group in NASA that under any circumstances did not want this information out, and there were other honest, interested scientists and engineers who did want to get to the bottom of this and explore it. And, you know, Keith and I have got tons of stories, and I'm sure he can regale you with some of them, you know, after the top of the hour when I go away. But the one thing that I do want to mention is that after the Goddard invite, I got a kind of a gilt-edged invitation to speak on the same subject, our work on Cydonia, at NASA Lewis. And Keith was again witness to some very bizarre events that took place as that unfolded.
You want me to take that from here?
Take it away, Keith.
Here's what happened. All right, they invited Richard out. They had posters up. They had a number for the employees to sign off their time so they could attend this meeting. They had it on closed circuit to other areas of the compound. They wanted people to know what was going on here. They invited Richard up. They videotaped him the day before the briefing.